in response to Iran's most recent attack, the Shiite militia attack on an American facility that killed an American contractor. And,
what do you think would have been the
others.
appropriate response, Senator?
Well, the president had access.
The American contractor.
The president had a range of options at his disposal. I know some of them would have included either a cyber attack or a lower level military attack on Iranian capacities or assets. I'm just struck by the fact that the killing of Soleimani was a very significant escalation. And I hope that there has been a thorough plan put together about what the next steps will be, because a strong Iranian response throughout the region is predictable.
Do you think that, given the escalation that Iran had producing was past 18 months?
Sort of imagery, and having been there, I can imagine that the president is lashing back to those scenes when he was in Iraq at the time, meeting with soldiers
of Iraq's. And now they find themselves essentially at ground zero for what could be a massive conflagration between the two sides. That is not where they want to be. If you think about what's happened in the past few months, they've recently just kicked ISIS out of their country, and so now they find themselves essentially in the middle of these two sides, with Iran and the U.S. Using Iraq essentially as a staging ground for what could really turn out to be a major escalation of violence there.
All right, Alex, thank you. We have more news coming in from Baghdad. We're going to go there in just a moment as our breaking news coverage continues. We are also just learning that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the Defense Secretary Mark Esper have just arrived at the White House, presumably to meet with the President of the United States. We'll be right back.
Versus others, thrusting that upon them. And do we have a procedure that works? I mean, and you asked a minute.
For more information, go to our website, Student Camp.
Military districts in the nation, and I know that the thoughts of your constituents are on your mind, and I also know that it's time for America to also recognize the work that you've done on the Labor Committee. So please, if you would, Mr. Scott.
Well, thank you, and I thank the gentleman from California for yielding. And yes, we have a lot of military installations in the Hampton Roads area, and we're very concerned about the present situation in the Middle East. But we want to talk about what's going on in the Committee on Education and Labor. And I just want to share a few things that we've been doing over the last year.
There was no expectation, based on sources I talked to in the hours immediately after the Soleimani strike, that Iran would not retaliate. Just no expectation that they would just simply do nothing after Soleimani was taken out by President Trump. I know that preparations were in place in the moments before, immediately after the strike, knowing there would be retaliation from Iran. The president at the time, of course, was down in South Florida. We were down there covering him in West Palm Beach, and the activity level, based on my sources, had intensified at Mar-a-Lago, with the president huddling with the aides, phone, some in person, to talk through what those next steps would be. So it is not a surprise, and it should not be a surprise to, frankly, anybody, much less anybody sitting in the West Wing right now, that Iran would have in fact retaliated. What would retaliation look like? Now we have a more clear picture of that as this is unfolding tonight. We also know if it's over yet or if there's more to come.
Yeah, it looks like one of those road rages where both are out of their car, face to face. The question is, who's going to get back in their car and drive away? It doesn't look like either side's going to do that tonight. Thank you so much. Great reporting as ever from top White House correspondent Hallie Jackson. NBC's Cal Perry is over in Doha, Qatar. Cal, what do you know up there about the tit for tat, which is ongoing now? We've got a shooting war.
Yeah, we know it's happening as we speak. There was at least one wave of rockets hitting that Al-Assad airbase, as Hallie sort of laid out, iconic for many reasons, the least of which is now on Iranian state television. They will be able to play video of President Trump visiting the troops there. This was clearly a signal, not only to people in Iran, I think, but around the world. The key being these rockets were fired from Iran into Iraq. We're used to seeing and talking, of course, about these Shia militias using these Katyusha rockets. Katyusha rockets power themselves. They are rockets onto themselves. These were ballistic missiles, at least a dozen of them fired from Iran. Chris, these missiles would have had to travel 200 miles. So what the Iranians are doing is not only retaliating for General Soleimani, not only hitting that U.S. target, but they're demonstrating capabilities. They're sending a message to the U.S. military that they are willing to use these ballistic missiles. They have not been willing to use them in the past, but clearly after the killing of General Soleimani, they are literally breaking out the big guns. The U.S. military is obviously going to stay on a state of high alert. I think the key here, Chris, is whether or not this attack is over. If this is just the first wave of many waves, or if this is the retaliation and the Iranians will now wait to hear from the Americans, Chris.
Let's talk about the weaponry here. It's asymmetric as always with us in the Middle East. We used drones from a helicopter to kill the General Soleimani. They're using ballistic missiles, which are not exactly surgical. Tell me about that, Cal. When they shoot those missiles into our base, anything in front of them gets exploded and killed. So they're not really being careful about our service people over there. They're out to kill people.
They are. They're out to kill American service members, and they're out to make a statement. The point you make is an excellent one. They could have used drones. The Iranians have a fairly good drone program. They used drones in September to attack oil fields in Saudi Arabia. They could have done that in a place like the United Arab Emirates, in a place like Qatar behind me, a strike in the Gulf. But these ballistic missiles are, massive depending on the payload. You can load anything into the top of these ballistic missiles, and it appears as though, at the very least, what was loaded into them was very high explosives. So the way that this attack was carried out, very conscious choice from the Iranians. Also the timing. Look, we had that 3-day period of mourning while they buried General Soleimani, while they rallied around a flag. They made him the biggest hero that he could be. And then almost virtually as soon as that funeral was over, we saw the response. There had been a lot of talk that they would take their time. They did not. Certainly, I think the fact that they have unleashed these ballistic missiles, and a dozen of them that appear to have hit the target, is hugely significant. They're also testing President Trump. President Trump has now boxed himself in, telling the American people that he would respond if American personnel or American assets, bases in the region are targeted. That's exactly what the Iranians did. Clearly, they are, at the very least, trying to see how far the U.S. is willing to take this, Chris.
Cal Perry over at Doha. Thank you for that great reporting. I'm back now with Jeremy Bash. And joining me now is Malcolm Nance, Msnbc terrorism analyst, and Joshua Geltzer, former senior director of counterterrorism at the NSC. Let me go to Malcolm this. Malcolm,
last week.
What is your assessment of what Iran's next move is and the tenuous situation that they find themselves in? Obviously, under the stranglehold of very intense sanctions, unrest in their streets, thousands of people protesting against the leadership in Iran. And what do you think the United States' role should be or should not be with regard to the divide between the people and the leadership in Iran?
Well, I think that Iran only responds to pressure. I mean, the economic pressure is working. Their economy is failing. But if we give them another pass, like we did with the maritime attacks in the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf, the attack on the Saudi airfield, the rocket attacks that killed a U.S. contractor, sooner or later you have to say you've crossed a line and there has to be a consequence for it. The Iranian leadership only respond to proportionate force. They need to understand there's a consequence for this. The only thing that gives me any pause here is the safety and security of the American and who are at risk. And I hope everybody in America will say for them and families.
We certainly will. Phyllis, thank you. Good to speak with you tonight.
Killed or wounded, but we are hearing that they are on the Iraqi side. This base, like many of the bases in Iraq that houses U.S. forces, also houses Iraqi forces. Al-Assad itself is a massive, huge, sprawling complex that does have a U.S. and an Iraqi side. So at this stage, we are hearing reports about casualties on the Iraqi side. And in this kind of warfare that has been unfolding so far, whether it's when the Iranian proxies here end up firing at U.S. locations or the other types of attacks that do take place oftentimes Iraqi security forces, because they are co-located, do end up also suffering casualties on their side as well. Given the dynamics that have been unfolding here, Aaron, what we don't know is if this is the start of something bigger, like Iran and its proxies in Iraq have been promising, or if this is some sort of message to the U.S., because right now the Iranian-backed proxies here have really begun upping their rhetoric when it comes to their desire to see American forces out of Iraq. This is not just about revenge for what took place. This is about seeing, at least for them, American forces leaving.
All right, Arwa Damon, thank you very much. We're going to go back to Arwa as she gets more. Of course, there are 5,000 American troops stationed around Iraq at this moment. I want to go now to Democratic Congressman Eliot Engel of New York. He is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Chairman, is this now a war?
Well, it could very well be, and the president and his crew better figure out a way to sort of tone down everything, because we could be in the middle of a full-fledged war, and I don't think that's something anybody wants. There's no doubt that America would win any kind of war, but the casualties would be horrific, and I don't think the American people are ready for it. I know Congress is not ready for it, and you know, you had to expect that there would be some retaliation such as this. I don't like the regime in Tehran, but I don't think we want to go to war with them.
So the president earlier today said he would attack. That's his word. He would attack in retribution if Iran were to strike any sort of an air base or anything like that. And he also, as I mentioned a few days ago, said that he would engage in a disproportionate response if he felt like it, and that it didn't matter what Congress said, that he could do that. Do you believe that Secretary Esper, Secretary Pompeo are going to be able to talk to him tonight and get him to not do something like that?
Well, I would hope so. You know, talk is cheap, and bluster is cheap, and we can, you know, all be the toughest guy on the block and, you know, dare someone to knock our head off. But that's really irresponsible. I think what we have to do now is tone down the rhetoric on all sides and try to see how we can sort of extricate ourselves from this nightmare, because I don't think the American people want to go to war. And you know, the irony is we talk about Iran and Iraq. You know, the United States is really, in my view, is really responsible for making Iran the hegemonic power in the region, because by knocking off Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and you remember that Iraq and Iran kept having these wars fighting each other. So what we did was we drove Iraq closer to Iran and made Iran the hegemonic power in the region, which is not what we wanted to do. So I hope the president and his aides are thinking this one through very carefully. I don't believe there's any good ending if we're in a full-fledged war.
What should the president do? I mean, you do. I mean, whatever your feelings about how we got to this point, you now have more than a dozen ballistic missiles fired at 2 air bases where U.S. troops are stationed. Unclear if there are American casualties, unclear if Iran intended for there not to be American casualties. We just don't know, but we do know that this is a game changer, right? They launched them from inside Iran, their sovereign territory. They launched them at American interests. Doesn't the president have to do something?
Well, the president has to do something, but he doesn't need to exacerbate the situation and make it tit for tat, and before you know it, we're in a full-fledged war. Look, you can't be belligerent and then when it doesn't work the way you had hoped, turn around and just walk away. There are consequences here. One of the things that I've had difficulty with this administration is that we don't seem to be utilizing any of our allies. We don't seem to care about any of the groups we belong to, like NATO. The president seems to trash them, and we could be using the help of some of our NATO allies right now, and hopefully the president and calmer heads will prevail and the president will do something like that. But you know, again, they're not sweethearts in the government in Tehran, but on the other hand, do we really want a full-fledged war? I think the answer is no.
All right, thank you very much, Chairman Engel. I appreciate your time tonight. The panel is back with me. Also joining us now on the phone, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, who was the commander of the U.S. Task Force in northern Iraq. General, what's your reaction here as this news is coming in? Ballistic missiles from Iran. They're threatening a second wave. Unclear what that means, targeting 2 U.S. bases.
Yeah, a couple things, Aaron. I'll start by saying, preface everything I say by the fact it's very easy to fall into a war and to start a war. It's a whole lot more difficult to extricate yourself from it. What we're seeing now is an update of the strategic game by Iran. These are ballistic missiles, as some of your previous folks have already said. This is very different than launching a couple of rockets at a military base, which Iran proxies have done in the past. This is a cross-border operation with a large ballistic missile, missiles that Iran has a lot of, that they've not only made themselves, but they've also purchased from Russia. Second thing, they are sending some very specific messages. As I see it, this attack started about the same time of day that Soleimani was hit by a drone strike. So there is even a message in that. The fact that you have some members of the Iranian government tweeting out Iranian flags is trolling at the strategic level to our president. And then third, I think one of the big things is that Iraq is now right smack in the middle of this, and they are strategically driving more of a wedge between the United States and Iraq in terms of striking a target on Iraqi soil at their very first attempt to counter the U.S. forces. So that's sending a message to not only us, but to Iraq. If they are going to allow the U.S. to strike forces from off their soil, then be prepared to have more trauma within the government of Iraq. And this is one of the things that Barham Saleh, their president, has said specifically, that he didn't want to see Iraq go back into a cycle of violence. Unfortunately, because of what we now see as the potential for a huge proxy war between Iran and the United States, Iraq is going to be pulled into it. And then you have just the fact that you just reported the majority of the casualties seem to be on the Iraqi side. That's going to further inflame not only the Iraqi government, but the Iraqi people.
Yes, which I think is a crucial point. And again, that's very preliminary. It's from an Iraqi source, so we don't know yet anything on the American side. Pam, what are you hearing about the president's response? What Secretaries Esper and Pompeo are saying to him right now?
Well, this is a critical decision-making point for the president. Probably the biggest decision, essentially, he'll probably have to make in his presidency beyond the strike against Soleimani. And there's a lot to discuss here. Of course, they're looking at retaliatory options. It wasn't long ago, you keep pointing out, Aaron, that it was the president who tweeted, if Iran strikes American interests or personnel, Iran itself will be hit very fast, very hard, saying we are the biggest and by far the best in the world. And then we will be sending some of the brand new beautiful equipment. So the president essentially drew a red line for himself, and now we're seeing this play out. Iran is retaliating after the strike, and now the ball is in the president's court in terms of how he's going to respond. This is a president who has said many times he doesn't want to go to war with Iran. He campaigned on this idea of getting out of foreign entanglements, and now he is in this position where he said he's going to respond. It's also worth noting, Aaron, that some of the intelligence that led to the strike against Soleimani, I'm told by a source, was concern about an imminent attack on the Al-Assad air base. And so, to General Hertling's point, it does also appear that Iran is trying to send a signal that you may have taken off one of our key players or military players, but we are still capable of causing great harm. Aaron.
All right, all of you stay with me. Our breaking news continues. We are getting more information here about casualties.
Noted on many times with this attack is the missiles were fired from inside the borders of Iran. Again, we're told the missiles are either cruise missiles or short-range ballistic missiles. So far, we're hearing no reports about the damage or the casualties, and we certainly don't want to speculate. There was also a false alarm at the Al-Assad air base just a few days ago, and in the wake of the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the military bases across the Middle East used by American troops have been fortified, though as you might imagine, because of the military climate in the region, they are always on high alert. There are also reports that another base housing U.S. troops in Erbil, that's in the northern part of the country.
The best way to achieve a goal is to devote 100% of your time and energy to
900. Q! Do we have any Qs up there? Yes.
It's actually involved in both cases. She's part of the charges in LA, and she's supposed to be a supporting witness here in New York.
Tell me about that jury selection. Now,
attacks on the Al Anbar. Hello, can you hear me, Chris?
Yes.
Chris, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, Iran has launched attacks on the Al Anbar base in Iraq, which houses U.S. forces. They say if there's any retaliation, there will be a whole more wave of attacks on all U.S. bases in the region. We're just getting reports now that a second wave of rocket attacks have been launched from Iran. The IRGC was saying that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of this country, was in the control center coordinating these attacks. This bit I'm not sure about, but the Iran state media is claiming that 30 U.S. soldiers have been killed in this attack. Now, this is not confirmed. This is just coming from Iranian media. But we have just stepped over the precipice, Chris. We have entered a very unpredictable time. We have to see what the response is going to be from the United States. But this is undoubtedly the most serious moment between Iran and America in the last 40 years. It's very, very tense here on the way to the Bureau. I had the radio on. Songs of marches to war were being played. We're just getting reports now that Iran has deployed its entire air force. They are saying that if they are retaliated for against these attacks, they will launch attacks in the Emirates, in Dubai, and anywhere else that is complicit with the United States. Also, Ayatollah Khamenei just released a statement saying that he sees no difference between the United States and Israel in this conflict. So this is drawing people from all sides into this, what is potentially the beginning of a war, Chris. I don't know how this is going to go in the coming hours, but it's not looking good from the rhetoric that came out from President Trump earlier today, saying that he will retaliate against any retaliation from Iran. I think we can expect an attack on Iran imminently.
Let me ask you about putting those together and what you know over there, and that is the combination of the military actions by both sides, our killing or assassinating of the general, the revered General Soleimani, the references by the president in the last week to going after cultural sites. He sort of pulled back on that, but the fact that he threw that out there would go after their treasured Persian sites, which have got thousands of years of history and religion behind them. And now there's I'm sensing a religious fervor on the part of Khomeini. Once again, the conversation is getting to the point of almost mortality of each country. Both countries saying, we're throwing everything on the table here.
Absolutely, Chris. It seems like Iran is all in right now. Look, I mean, there have been very hardline elements in this country that have been staunchly anti-American since the revolution in 1979, and they've been itching for a conflict with the United States, and this seems to be the opening for that. Now, initially we were expecting Iran possibly to retaliate using its proxy forces in this region, but they've decided to use their conventional army, the IRGC, to send a very clear message to say that this is coming directly from Iran. They don't want this to be mistaken for a sign of weakness, that they need to rely or prop up on their proxies. So, yeah, I mean, all bets seem to be off. Is President Trump going to attack cultural sites here? I mean, that would make ordinary Iranians even more upset than they are now. I can tell you that a great sense of anxiety in this country, even though it's just gone past 4 in the morning. Everybody is awake now. They're calling each other. People are trying to get their families out of the major cities like Tehran, out into the countryside. You have to remember, Chris, this is a country that experienced an 8-year bloody war with Iraq where 500,000 Iranians were killed. You know, I know many, many people here that still remember the air raid sirens going off and having to go and hide in bunkers in Tehran. It looks like those scenarios may be unfolding again, but they're not facing Iraq this time. They're facing the United States. You know, the United States has a formidable military force. Iran's air force and navy are no match for America's military might, but they can wreak absolute havoc in this area. if all of those militias suddenly rise up, all U.S. personnel in this region are in grave danger. Earlier on today, Khatib Hezbollah, which is the militia group under Iran's patronage that attacked the U.S. embassy, that sparked off this initial crisis, had released a statement this morning saying that we are waiting for Iran's arm to launch a military strike against U.S. forces, and then we'll go immediately into action. So we're expecting the proxies also to strike back at any moment now as well. I mean, this is, I guess, what you call the fog of war. We're not sure what's going to happen from moment to moment as we're going forward, but I think Iran also caught America off guard. They've been saying they're going to attack. They were trying to keep it as sort of elusive as possible, if you will, and all of a sudden, in the dead of night, they have hit that base in Iraq. Which we have to see how the U.S. retaliates. If the U.S. retaliates, this is going to blow up beyond any imagination.
Ali Ruzzi over in Tehran, you've given us a lot of clarity tonight, sir, in these remarkable circumstances. I'm going to bring in Mark Jacobson, former Defense Department senior advisor, who joins us by phone. Mark, the question is, if Iran is serious now in threatening, if we go back and retaliate for this attack, they're going everywhere to hit us with all kinds of, this goes into pretty much a real war, a total war.
Well, Chris, this is how you stumble backwards into a war, and I think historians are going to look back and see JCPOA, see the killing of Soleimani, and right now we're at the narrow end of a funnel in terms of strategic options, and I don't see how you do respond without incurring further responses by the Iranians. Now, there is one thought I've had listening to the discussions, and that's we may choose a series of strikes to suppress Iranian defenses, which would be a prerequisite to any sort of larger set of strikes. But it sends a really loud signal that, look, you want to escalate? We're going to escalate beyond where you think we're going to go. And while I agree with Jeremy Bash's comment earlier that sometimes you see some restraint from the White House, and you see the generals acting like they'd like to go to war and take advantage of the situation, I worry that we don't have that restraint. Trump is knee-jerk. If the Soleimani strike teaches us anything, we better hope the Pentagon doesn't put any ridiculous throwaway options in the next paper.
Yeah, those options they thought the president wouldn't use, but they did. Let me go back. Thank you very much, Mark Jacobson. Let me go to Ben Rhodes. Ben,
difficult to confirm at this point, but across the region, people certainly are very much on edge about this. The 2,000 ballistic missiles that Iran has pose a real threat, not just to Iraq and to the bases here that the US have, but to all the other regional allies. And we've seen Secretary Pompeo releasing transcripts and notes of calls that he has had with various allies in the region, everyone from the Qataris to the Kuwaitis to the Saudis. And certainly they would have been talking through the options, talking about what potentially could lie ahead. Many experts have said, looking at Iran, it's spent the last 10 years building up its regional influence, that it controls and it has huge influence on both Syria and Iraq, and that they would not want to throw that away in an all-out military confrontation with the US that they simply cannot win. And so many people thought that their retaliation would somehow be a way of saving face, but hopefully not enough to invite that full-scale retaliation. Well, now we just have to wait to see what the US does and what effect these ballistic missiles have had. But again, as we've been saying, this is a game changer in the sense that it is an attack from Iran directly. It's not using their proxies anymore. This is taking everything up a step, and so a nervous wait at the moment. And we're seeing Iranian state television at the moment and all their the Twitter handles cheering this at the moment, really making the most of it, saying this is the revenge, this is the retaliation that we've been talking about, this is the retaliation that we want. And the people in Iran, frankly, have been baying for blood, calling for American blood to be spilled. Their military leaders, their political leaders have all made that very clear that that's what they wanted in this retaliation. We don't know, as I said, if that's the case. But the US has been getting ready for some kind of a response, and there were indications that they may have been preparing for some kind of a strike tonight. But B-52 bombers have also flown over from the US. Those are in place. Remember the 3,000 extra troops that came over to Kuwait just in the last couple of days, on top of the 750 who came a couple of days before that. An extra 100 into the Iraq.
Essentially what the Iranians are saying there, Aaron, and I think this is something that's key because the senior advisor to the Supreme Leader told me the same thing as well. They are saying that this is their retaliation and they want it to end there. They don't want America to strike back, and they're essentially saying that they don't want this to turn into a larger war. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be the only retaliation or this is going to be the only strikes that we're going to see, but the Iranians are essentially warning President Trump and the U.S. not to continue and escalate the situation any further. They're then warning other governments in the region not to provide the U.S. with any capabilities to launch attacks at Iran, saying that any governments that do so would also become targets for Iran as well. They then threaten Israel, saying that they don't consider what they call a Zionist regime to be separate from America. And then, and finally, this is also quite interesting, they urge the American people to call on American troops from the region to prevent further casualties and not allow essentially the Trump administration to endanger their lives. So obviously, essentially telling American forces in that region not to follow President Trump's orders if those are to attack Iran. So you can see they seem to have put the statement out, or they seem to have drafted the statement at least well in advance. This does appear more and more, Aaron, like a very, very concerted and orchestrated retaliation by the Iranians.
Extremely so. General Hartling, though, you heard what Fred's saying. They're seeming to indicate that they don't want this to go further. But there's no way the United States... Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And the other thing that I would point out is if this was a commanded strike, in other words, if the government of Iran actually said execute this strike, and it certainly appears that it does, this being the first wave is something that I think the American military has feared in terms of our dealings with Iran. Because first of all, if it's a strike from the government of Iran, again, bringing the Iraqi government into this and having a proxy war on Iraqi territory, that's one dynamic that we can ill afford to approach. The other thing is there are literally hundreds of proxy forces, not with ballistic missiles, but just rockets that could fire on U.S. forces throughout the Middle East. And we're not just talking about Iraq, but in places like Yemen, in Syria, in Somalia, and the list could go on, to include potentially Lebanon, Jordan, and even Israel.
So Jim, we'll see what the president says tonight. But I think that it is important to emphasize to people watching how important two other people are tonight. Mike Pompeo and Mark Esper.
Absolutely.
They are in that room with him right now.
And keep in mind as well that Mike Pompeo, to our knowledge, has been pushing for a forceful response to Iran for some months prior to this, and was apparently behind the Soleimani killing for some time. So his posture, you might say, is more forward-leaning. But again, both sides have opportunities to calibrate their responses here. It's possible Iran calibrated theirs tonight. How does the U.S. respond? That's the key question.
And those are the crucial questions here at this moment. Every second counting as we are learning more and still have so many questions. We do not yet know details about any American casualties. We do, however, know that there were casualties on the Iraqi side. Unclear whether they are killed or wounded. Huge night unfolding. Our coverage continues now with Anderson Cooper.
Good evening. Tonight, just days after a U.S. drone strike killed a top Iranian general and terror organizer, American troops who come under missile fire in Iraq and Iran is claiming responsibility. According to the Pentagon, more than a dozen surface-to-surface ballistic missiles were launched from Iran, targeting at least 2 Iraqi bases housing Americans and coalition personnel. One at Al-Assad, the other in Erbil. President Trump visited Al-Assad a little more than a year ago. This is video from Iranian state TV. We can't independently vouch for it, but it claims to be a missile of missiles falling on Al-Assad. The question is what happens next, of course. Will President Trump respond, or how will he respond? Remember, just 2 days ago, this is what he promised in a tweet. Quoting now, "The United States just spent $2 trillion on military equipment. We are the biggest and by far the best in the world. If Iran attacks an American base or any American, we will be sending some of that brand new beautiful equipment their way, and without hesitation." We have correspondents in all three capitals, Washington, Baghdad, and Tehran. I want to first check in with our CNN's Barbara Starr. So what's the latest from the Pentagon?
Latest from the Pentagon, Anderson, is that they say that more than a dozen, we now know them to be short-range ballistic missiles, were fired from inside Iran against these positions at Al-Assad and Erbil, both locations inside that host U.S. forces.
Uzi reports the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that was the special forces that Soleimani oversaw. That Guard Corps in Iran is claiming this is revenge for the killing of General Soleimani, and that any countries that allow U.S. attacks from their soil will also be attacked. Uzi also just reporting the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is saying that a second wave of missiles has now been launched. And joining me now is Ali Arouzi, NBC News Tehran bureau chief, who is in Tehran tonight. What
militia inside the borders of Iraq. Then in response, we saw the militia just off to my left in Baghdad's green zone ordering the storming of the U.S. embassy. And then early Friday, President Trump ordering that drone strike to take out Qasem Soleimani, Iran's top military.
That they have launched a second wave of attacks in that same vicinity. We're also getting unconfirmed reports from state media saying that they have leveled the Ain al-Assad base in Iraq and they have killed 30 U.S. troops. Now, Iran is saying that if there is any retaliation from the United States from these latest two attacks that they have launched by the IRGC directly, they will target all U.S. bases, and the first immediate targets will be in Dubai because U.S. planes have been reported to take off from Dubai. They said that they will destroy what they called that tourism resort, and then they will target Haifa in Israel. We're also getting reports that Iran's militias that Qasem Soleimani had built up in this region are now ready for all sorts of attacks. The Hashd al-Shabi, a major militia in Iraq, are saying that they are on alert and ready and waiting orders from Iran to launch attacks on any bases that are necessary. Iranian state media, Tasmin News, is saying that Hezbollah in Lebanon is also ready to attack Israel if Iran is attacked by the United States after these latest rocket launches. Iran is saying that they launched medium-board ballistic missiles at the Ain al-Assad base in Iraq. I just can't begin to tell you how serious this situation is. There has never been any sort of confrontation between Iran and America directly like this since the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979, and things are just very, very unpredictable. Iranian officials here are all putting out messages on their social media showing the Iranian flag. That is a signal of being battle ready in this country. On my way to the bureau, the radio was on. Songs of battle marches were being played on the radio. We have reports as well from the IRGC that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of this country, was in the control room coordinating all of these attacks. They're also reporting that Iran's Air Force has been deployed and they are ready to intercept any attacks from the United States. Now, of course, Chris, Iran's Air Force and Navy are no match for the might of the U.S. military, but Iran does have this widespread network of militias in this region that are all located very close to U.S. personnel, U.S. bases. They have said time and time again that they could strike immediately at any of these bases and cause severe damage. So that's what we're expecting to happen next if there is an attack by the United States. Basically, the message coming out of Iran right now is that they have launched these two attacks. The ball is in the court of the United States. If they decide to retaliate for what Iran has just done, well, then all bets are off and we could be in a full-blown war, Chris.
Ali, I want to just refer to something you said earlier, which is state media talking about leveling Al-Assad Air Base and there being 30 casualties. I just want to be very clear, we don't have independent confirmation of that as of yet. That is a claim being made on Iranian state media, just so that viewers who are tuning in understand that that is not confirmed independently by reporters on the ground or by Pentagon at at this moment. I want to follow up on your question about the sort of the kind of escalatory calculation here. Obviously, there was widespread anticipation after the United States took the extraordinarily escalatory step of assassinating the General Qasem Soleimani that there would be some kind of retaliation from the Iranian government against U.S. forces. There is some question, I suppose, about whether there has been a calculation made to do that in a way that would allow an end to the back and forth. If there's a calculation by the Iranian regime that this won't lead to further attacks, or whether that wasn't the calculation, that essentially they need to sort of save face, they need to retaliate in their mind, and this is what they're doing.
Well, it's a little bit of both, Chris. They definitely thought that they had to retaliate no matter what happens. The mentality here amongst the leadership was that if they don't strike back, they're going to come across as weak, and there will be more pressure from America on Iran. Now, the question is the proportionality of this attack. As you mentioned, the reports of the level of damage and the casualties are completely unconfirmed. But if it's a small attack, it could give the United States enough space not to launch an all-out reprisal. But if we are talking about 10, 20s, 30s numbers of U.S. personnel being killed, I don't think President Trump is going to see that as proportional. He has been putting messages out that he will hit back if Iran hits. I don't think he's going to take U.S. troops being killed very lightly. So as the fog sort of clears and we find out what sort of damage has happened, then we will be able to assess what kind of response is going to come back from America. But it's not looking good, Chris. Iran has launched an attack, a direct attack, not by its militias, but by its armed forces on U.S. bases in Iraq with ballistic missiles. This is a huge step across the precipice, and it's really unclear, unpredictable how this is going to fold out in the coming minutes, if not hours and days.
All right, Ali Arouzi, stay safe, and thank you so much for joining us. I want to make an important note here. Those bases that are being attacked are Iraqi bases. They hold Iraqi members of the Iraqi military, and they also host American service members. There is the fact that this is all being waged in Iraq, that a country that has seen nothing but war since the U.S. invasions.
It's hard to know exactly what is happening. I just got a text from someone I consider trustworthy and well-connected. And again, who knows, because this is developing. But this is from Baghdad right now, and I'm quoting, "The next steps in phase of this geopolitical struggle will definitely be on the airwaves soon." Hard to know, but it suggests that a lot is at stake and people are thinking about this in big terms. Bret Baier, essentially runs politics here at Fox. Always happy to have him on our show. Joins us on set tonight. Where are we in this?
Yeah, I'm talking to sources inside Iraq, inside the U.S. government. Here's what we know. We know that 2 bases have been struck by the Iranians with missiles from Iran, which in and of itself is a huge escalation. Many people thought that the attacks would be coming from proxies inside Iraq. These are fired from Iran. But the choice of those 2 bases is interesting. One was Al-Assad, which is in the Sunni stronghold of Al-Anbar province. The other one is Erbil, which is the Kurdish capital. They don't have as many U.S. forces as Balad, which is a major base that's actually closer to Iran. Is this a signal? Is this a message? Is it because the Sunnis and the Kurds were supporting the U.S. and against the Shia in the Iraqi parliament who...
So what you're saying is if you're Iran and you wanted to inflict maximum damage on American troops in Iraq, you would have hit a different base?
And it would have been easier. Balad is a major base and it's closer to Iran. I'm reading through the tea leaves here.
No, it makes
sense. That we'll see what the damage assessment is, but if, as reported, that no U.S. casualties, we don't know if the Iraqis took casualties at either one of these bases. I think what you're seeing here from your source on the ground in Baghdad could be, more about the Iranian Shia militias that support Iran that may be active inside Baghdad, which we saw during the Iraq War.
For sure. It was a defining factor. So how is this, and again, this is moving even as we speak, but to the extent we can tell now, how is this affecting the presidential race currently in progress? How is that breaking down?
I think we have yet to see. I think that this is the biggest test for President Trump as a leader. It is by far his biggest test. As you know, he campaigned on getting out of the Middle East, of bringing troops home. This is his moment to decide how far to push this, what the response is. And what that response will be will dictate how the rest of the world reacts. As far as the politics, it changed the Democratic race significantly. You've seen Bernie Sanders go far hard on this Iran issue. Joe Biden is trying to ride the rails, but he has his own issues about what the Obama administration did with Iran and the red line and the paying of money to Iranian officials.
So it's not, I guess what I'm asking is...
It's not cut and dry.
It's not. It's hard as someone watching this who's not covering politics full-time anymore, as you are, to see how it doesn't seem like the Democrats are all the way on one side and Republicans all the way on the other. It's more confusing than that.
100%. And the fact that we are now in an election year, that we are 3.5 weeks away from the Iowa caucuses, this is a major event that will have big repercussions. But most importantly, the next steps on the ground in Iraq, in Iran, and whether those targets inside Iran, maybe that shot those missiles, will be in the sights of U.S. warplanes. We don't know.
So is it clear the White House, I hate to use the phrase talking points, but position, like if you were to sit down with the president or one of his advisors and say, what's our plan going forward, is it clear what the answer would be? Or is that the purpose, do you think, of the president addressing the nation tonight?
That's the purpose. If and when he does it, that'll be a clear, here's where we are, this is what I'm thinking. Notice we didn't hear anything from the Gang of Eight or anybody up on Capitol Hill after they were briefed by officials. The whole House and Senate expected to be briefed tomorrow on the intelligence that led to the taking out of Soleimani based on what they said was an imminent attack that was coming. I think there's heavy skepticism up on Capitol Hill and in different corners, and maybe that's what the president's going to address.
He's going to address why we did it.
Yeah, and maybe next steps. I mean, this is the moment where the country is going to want to know, where are we going from here? The damage assessment, by now, they have a decent sense of what it looks like on the ground.
So I know you're not in the editorializing business, but tell me if you can confirm this instinct. My sense is of the president that he's not interested in some kind of protracted war with Iran, certainly not a ground war, that he's not... his instincts are restrained. Is that what you're sensing or hearing?
Policy-wise, what he campaigned on, that's what he suggests. But what he says verbally about being tough against Iran, what he tweets out sends a different message.
Yeah.
So whether his rhetoric matches up with what the policy decision is going to be tonight, I think is the key moment for this president as commander-in-chief.
And last question. Do you think we are going to hear from the president tonight?
I would guess that we would, because it's that big of a moment.
Yes.
And listen, having covered the Pentagon for a long time, there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes. There's all kinds of targets that have already been chosen. The question is whether we are going to step to that next level, and what our response will be.
And this being Washington, and Washington being fundamentally bureaucratic, a lot of Pentagon employees, including uniform, were sent home today.
Which is surreal.
Early because of a snowstorm that never really materialized, because once again, this is the federal government.
It's unbelievable. At 1 o'clock, it was a ghost town. There was nobody there. As this all was happening, the public relations office apparently was closed down. It was like tumbleweeds going through the Pentagon.
It's not shocking to those of us who live here, but to the rest of the country, they must be watching with jaws open. Brett Baer, great to see you. Thank you so much for that.
Sure, Tucker.
Fight ISIS. They're not here to fight Iran. The official mission of the U.S. troops is to fight a combined effort to support the Iraqi government in its effort to fight against ISIS. They don't have a mission to launch assassinations of
operation is actually called Operation Hard Revenge. It's interesting because on a Telegram channel from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Revolutionary Guard Corps seems to indicate that if the U.S. responds to this retaliation, that the Revolutionary Guard Corps could respond then inside the United States. That's another threat that's coming out. The Revolutionary Guard
Because for the first time, this is missiles fired from inside Iran. Previously, Iran have only...
We will see if the U.S. response, if there is a response, is proportionate. If it is a response to a few remote bases that don't cause many casualties, perhaps this could cool down. If, however, the U.S. Responds heavily and there is massive devastation, or the U.S. attacks a civilian population area in Tehran or something close to a civilian center, then Iran will escalate and perhaps mobilize the militias it was talking about, the militias here in Iraq, the militias in Lebanon and in other locations. But in the shadows here, and I don't want to take you too much on a tangent, but in the shadows here, just something to watch. Vladimir Putin just showed up in the region. He made an unannounced visit to Damascus today. He's supposed to go to Istanbul tomorrow to meet with the Turkish President Erdogan. Vladimir Putin is someone who in the past has liked to play peacemaker, liked to intervene, particularly when the U.S. is finding that its chips are down. Russia has very good relations with Iran, and Russia is someone that, Vladimir Putin is someone that President Trump does like to listen to. So I would not be surprised if you started to hear Russia try to play peacemaker in all of this, if there is the opportunity to broker some sort of agreement.
All right, Richard Engel, thank you for all your work tonight. I really appreciate it. Joining me now, Courtney Kuby, NBC News.
The #1 terrorist in the world that was working for the Iranian government. By the same token, the Iranians got their message across by sending these rockets into the base at Al-Assad and up to Erbil. Right now, we're kind of like that operational pause. We're assessing damage. We're seeing what's going on. Signals have been set and received for on both sides. This is actually the perfect opportunity to take that measured step back and determine, okay, do we need to continue an escalatory process, or is this in fact the opportunity to allow diplomacy to step in, allow both sides to disengage, go to their neutral corners, figure out what we can do, and in fact, I see a greater opportunity to now come to the negotiating table than I think we've had previously.
Dexter Filkins, I'm wondering what you make of that. The president tweeted, which we read at the top of the broadcast just a couple days ago, if they strike an American base, we have all these, I'm paraphrasing, highly beautiful new expensive weapons that we'll send over there.
Yeah. My sense of this strike that happened this evening is that everything about it suggests that it was done primarily for Iranian domestic political reasons. They are basically speaking to their constituency and their public.
They're showing that we've done something.
Look, we did it. Yeah, I mean, if you start with the National Security Council meeting that the Iranians had yesterday, there was a story in the Times this morning, the New York Times, in which the Supreme Leader was quoted as demanding a proportionate response. I want us to do this, and I want us to do it, visibly and rapidly. And there were three sources for that story, and it struck me as that was an orchestrated leak. The Iranians wanted us to read that. They want their own people to see it. They're trying to satisfy their public now, which is like very agitated and very angry and wants revenge. And I think this was more about them than it was about us. They didn't kill any Americans. As far as we know.
Right, yeah, and we should say, these are very early reports. We really have no idea, and as we all know, and as everybody who's watching knows, early reports in any kind of conflict, kinetic activity are often wrong or just it's just too early to tell exactly what has gone on the ground there. We're also joined by General Mark Hertling, who has spent a lot of time obviously serving in Iraq. General Hertling, Dexter Filkins, I don't know if you just heard what he was saying, that this seems like a very thought-out response, and perhaps in response largely to domestic pressures within Iran for some sort of response, given all the other options at the disposal of Iran.
I agree completely with that, Anderson. We're talking about not only the timing of the attack,
which appears to have coincided with the same time that Soleimani was attacked with the drone strike, that it's messaging toward the Iranian people, saying that we pride ourselves in countering any kind of actions by the great Satan. And then the third message, which I think is just as important, is it's done on Iraqi soil. It pulls them into this fray. Iran and Iraq have not had a history of great relationships. They've been trying to pull together a little bit more closely lately. There's been some dynamics involved in that, but to strike a U.S. base on Iraqi soil is sending not only a message to the United States, but to Iraq as well, of stay out of this proxy war, because if you're sucked into it, you're going to bear the repercussions as well. All of those are huge messaging attributes, to include the fact that they use ballistic missiles, not the kind of rockets that have been launched by Iranian proxies at U.S. bases in the past. These create some devastating effects, and the fact that there were 12 of them in the first wave to both Al-Assad and Erbil is significant, because those are two major U.S. bases right now.
Admiral Kirby, the Pentagon said they're working on initial battle damage assessments
and sending signals to Iran.
Ariane Tabatabai and Jake Sullivan, thank you so much for being here. Just to reset here, we have confirmation of Iranian ground-to-ground missiles being launched at several bases in Iraq, Iraqi bases that house American troops. We have no word yet on damage or casualties. Of course, those are huge questions that we will be following very closely. There are, according to Iranian state television, there's a second round of missiles that have also been launched, though we have no confirmation on the receiving end from the Pentagon or for reporters on the ground there about the status of that. And there are also state TV threats from the Iranian that if there is further retaliation after those two rounds, that there will be then devastating consequences. Joining me now, Steve Schmidt, Republican strategist and MSNBC contributor, and I just feel like we did not need to be at this point.
The genie is certainly out of the bottle now. Watching this, when you think about history and you think about momentous events, and we look back, for example, a year in Vietnam, did that occur in 65 or 66? And the memory doesn't quite get there, but history unfolds in real time, going forward, action by action, event by event, day by day. And we're at the early stages of a war. It is a monumental moment that the Iranian military has launched a ballistic missile attack.
Well, we certainly were expecting an attack from Iran, and I know we were moving troops to try to protect them as best we could. And so I know we've been very thoughtful about that. I'm just hoping that we hear that there are no casualties. Certainly, right now, seeing the number of missiles being shot at the bases there, I have a great deal of concern, but I'm still very hopeful.
Cannot control the Iranian response. And very quickly, we're in charge of Iraq. We deposed, in effect, the king and took control. Our State Department ran the country. Are you surprised at the degree to which it's now just an Iranian-controlled space?
It's the way we exited Iraq, Tucker. The fact that we exited without having behind us a unified, multi-ethnic, non-impacted by Iran Iraq. And so with time, basically, these militias took the control of the ministries.
Non-ethnic, were we naive to think that that was possible?
Well, if Iraq was founded as a federal state like Switzerland or Canada or even Cyprus in the past, that could have been possible. But what is happening right now is Iraq is divided at this point in time between the various sects, and we saw it when the Sunni and the Kurds withdrew from the parliament. But that is not the issue. The issue is what the Iranians have in mind for the next 12 hours.
You're absolutely right, and we don't know. Yes. Cyprus in the past, exactly. Well, so great to see you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
For these kinds of statements in the past, and then decided ultimately not to do them. The other thing we should point out is that some of the top advisors who are meeting with the president, people like the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and others who were here for meetings with the president this evening, they have also departed the White House. What all of that means, obviously we're going to be talking to our sources over the next several hours to determine exactly what was going on behind the scenes over here at the White House. But at least for the very moment, we can at least update our viewers and say that the president does not appear to be looking to make a statement to the nation tonight here at the White House, Anderson.
So just to be clear, you're saying that Pompeo, Milley, Esper, that they have left now?
We believe they have all left at this point. We just saw, that's right, the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs all file out of the White House within the last 10 or 15 minutes, I would say, Anderson. The Vice President as well. They were all here for about an hour, hour and a half, meeting with the President behind closed doors. The White House Press Secretary was also meeting with the President. They were all going over what has transpired in Iraq tonight, but it appears at the moment, at the very least, that the President is not going to be at least making a statement to the nation over the airways in terms of what the next steps will be for the U.S. Obviously, this is a very tender, delicate moment, and I think that all of that is being taken into consideration at this point.
All right. Well, we'll see if he decides to communicate in another form tonight. Jim Acosta, appreciate it. We're going to take a short break. A reminder, we're live at the 11 o'clock hour as well. CNN's live, of course, throughout the entire night. Coming up next, how this crisis could open the door to the return of forces such as ISIS. We'll hear from someone who wrote the book on it as our live coverage continues.
When I became Mike's worry monster, we'd stay up.
We have not seen any militia activity around Baghdad. Earlier in the week, a few rockets were fired into the green zone, and that has been a common occurrence here in Baghdad. But this is something tonight that it appeared the Iranians wanted to take clear credit for. Iranian state television indicated that Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, was actually the one calling the strikes tonight. But again, the reports indicating no American casualties, some Iraqi casualties, and there is still a damage assessment as to how much American military equipment was hit. Additionally, there were...
Now from Doha, Qatar, Cal Perry, NBC News correspondent, and Aaron Banco, national security reporter for the Daily Beast in Washington. Aaron, you've been reporting on the Iraqi military, the Iraqi government's reaction to all this. What have you learned, and what can you anticipate will be the effects of tonight's strikes?
So we've been in touch with our sources on the ground, Iraqi officials, senior Iraqi officials in both Baghdad and Erbil, who are still trying to figure out what exactly is going on the ground in their own country. And I think this is important given the context of the communication between the U.S. and Iraq over the last several days. We know that Washington has been in touch with Baghdad over the last couple of days about what their reaction is going to be to the vote that happened in Parliament a couple of days ago to oust U.S. troops, and about what their posture would be toward Iran in the country of Iraq in the coming weeks. Now, if Iraqi officials are on the ground telling us we're not exactly sure what's going on in our own country, how many people have been killed, what kind of infrastructure has been hit, I think that underscores the lack of communication, or at least quality of communication, between Washington and Baghdad about this attack. Now, secondly, I've heard a couple of other things from analysts and other officials in Washington who are saying nobody really knows what the Trump administration is going to do next. For the past several years, they have laid out a very strict sort of tactical policy on Iran that's been financial in nature. It's been the maximum pressure campaign, where they've put over 1,000 sanctions on Iran and Iranian entities. With the killing of Qasem Soleimani last week, everything turned military in nature. And so I think what people are waiting to see is if Trump will continue on that path, or whether some of the people who are the architects of that maximum pressure campaign will say, listen, this is the time to go back to that campaign. It was working. There's no need to go further with this military campaign.
Cal, Steve Schmidt referenced this, and others have as well. Of course, this comes in the midst of this kind of regional proxy war that has happened over the last few years, largely in the wake of both the American invasion in Iraq, the toppling of Saddam Hussein, a sort of growth of Iranian hegemony across a kind of crescent, and also its projection of force to save the government of Bashar al-Assad against the revolution that happened there. And now you've got into this hot war, or the beginnings of one that has happened. You've got to imagine that those regional players don't want this to escalate, but it's hard to say because there has been such agitation from folks in the UAE and the Saudis as well to kind of confront Iran.
Yeah, look, and this was the reason that Qasem Soleimani existed. When 1 million Iranians died in the 80s with a war with Iraq, it was decided that Iran, as a principled military, would fight its enemies outside of Iran and not inside of Iran. That's why you see Hezbollah on the Israeli border fighting the Israelis in 2006. It's why Qasem Soleimani was so engaged in fighting American troops in Iraq, and it's why the most recent warning coming from the Iranians in just the last half an hour was a warning specifically about Dubai and the Gulf nations. They want to keep them out of this. It's going to be very difficult to do so. I'm here in Qatar. 20 minutes from where I am is the largest U.S. base in the Middle East. It houses some 10 to 15,000 U.S. personnel. But look, 2 million people live in the shop behind me. And what is sort of the risk here, that this can get out of control. And all we're hearing from are the most extreme voices on either side. You have the U.S. Defense Secretary saying that they'll be happy to not start a war, but finish a war. The IRGC says, well, we're going to target Israel, we're going to target Dubai. Then the U.S. president says, I'm going to respond disproportionately. You can see how countries are simply not communicating at all. I think all of that is born out of the U.S. dumping and ripping up the nuclear agreement. The nuclear agreement allowed for a certain level of communication between these two countries. That level of communication tonight just doesn't exist. That's at a point now when you need it the most, when you need to de-escalate the situation, and the mechanism just doesn't exist, Chris.
All right. On the ground, in terms of the latest loop, there was that attack outside Kirkuk, a rocket attack. There had been increasing rocket fire at American forces from Shia militias in Iraq starting in October, as Brett McGurk said. That hadn't happened in 8 years. That itself was part of an escalatory cycle that started with the withdrawal from the Iran deal. That killed an American contractor back in December outside Kirkuk. It killed an American contractor. It wounded several American service members. There was a retaliatory strike by the U.S. It killed 25 Shia militia members in Iraq, and then that storming the embassy, which was essentially dispersed with no casualties. And then in response to that, the wildly provocative escalating act of taking out, killing Qasem Soleimani. So that is the situation that has brought us tonight to these reports of ground-to-ground missile fire from the Iranian government directed at Iraqi bases that hold both Iraqi service members and American service members. Donna, what do you think is happening right now? We have reports that Vice President Pence has briefed Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Pelosi tweeted out, she's closely monitoring the situation following bombings targeting U.S. troops in Iraq. We must ensure the safety of our service members, including ending needless provocations from the administration and demanding that Iran cease its violence. America and world cannot afford war. What do you think is happening in Democratic leadership at this moment?
Well, I think right now, they are trying to figure out a way that they can put the brakes on this president and this administration. And I think, a war powers resolution limiting the president's ability to conduct all-out war is one step. But even with that, the president would essentially have 30 to 60 days during which he could have full-scale military operations. This is absolutely insane, and it's going to draw us into that region in a way that we absolutely cannot afford.
All right, Mickey Edwards, Donna Edwards, Sam Cedars, Erlina Maxwell, thank you all for being here tonight. Before we go, I just want to say this very clearly, that a war with Iran is madness, and it is strategically and morally a disaster in the making, and don't believe anyone who tells you otherwise. That is all on for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, my friend. Much appreciated. And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. It will all happen at once. No matter how much we might wish that was not true, it will all happen at once. And because of that, part of our responsibility as citizens in this country at this time will be for us all to maintain the capacity to see multiple things at once, to follow multiple stories, to follow more than one bouncing ball at a time. And yes, it would be easier to follow, it would be easier to absorb, it would be easier to anticipate what was going to happen next if these kinds of world-changing and historic calamities would please happen in sequence or even bless us with a break in between them. But in our time, in our country, that is not our fate, not in this administration. And if all these things are going to happen at once, What that means for us is that we are just going to have to scale up our ability to understand, to synthesize, to keep the lens as wide as possible so we can be smart about multiple things at once. This is not a test.
Here for years, since 1979, by the way, it all started, they've been at war with us in Iran. The president, as of today and as of the killing of Soleimani, has shown enormous restraint. The last thing the president, as he stated as a candidate, was, and he seems to keep all his promises, that he wanted any long, protracted conflicts or war. If I, myself, in my own words, would have put the Trump doctrine into words, well, it would be about preserving the peace. In other words, this president has shown, and have been criticized for it, that he will talk to anyone, anywhere, to advance the cause of peace. Give a couple of examples. Kim Jong-un said he'd be willing to talk to Putin, said he'd even be willing to talk to Iran. But the president also said he's not going to get involved in the bribery business like in the case of Kim Jong-il and Bill Clinton. That didn't work out well. He's not going to give $150 billion in cash and other currencies like Obama and Biden did. In other words, this president's doctrine is no appeasement, no bribing of dictators that hate our guts in the hopes that maybe they'll like us. Still, President Trump, when push came to shove, he drew a line in the sand. He held back when Iran downed one of our drones, unmanned drones, and captured those tankers in the Gulf. Remember that? In the Straits of Hormuz. He also drew the red line in the sand, and he said, were the rogue regime to kill an American, and they did, an American contractor late December, and attack our embassy as they have. Remember, the terrorist group Hezbollah, that is funded completely by the Iranians. Iranians have been fomenting terror all around the world. They are the #1 state sponsor of terror. We know that they also have been using their surrogates and maybe even the money that Obama and Biden gave them to fight proxy wars. When that line was crossed at the end of December last year, the U.S. did respond. They had an opportunity. They took out Iran's top terrorist responsible for killing Americans on the ground in the most brutal ways inside of Iraq during that conflict. Now the mullahs have escalated tonight the conflict in a major way. This is their doing. For example, they're the ones that shot down the drone. They're the ones that have tried to stop the free flow of oil, the lifeblood of our economy, back at market prices. And they're the ones that also have been after America now since 1979. They've been attacking the civilized world since 1979 when they held our fellow Americans hostage at our own embassy. And more recently, they shot that drone out of the sky. And more recently, they captured international oil tankers in the very geopolitically strategic area, that narrow Straits of Hormuz. By the way, to impact the free flow of the lifeblood of every economy in the world. Then they attacked the Saudi Arabians' oil processing facilities. Now, as the world's #1 state sponsor of terror, they have coordinated deadly attacks all over the world. They fight these proxy wars. They fund terror. They actively try to wipe Israel off the face of the planet. They state it. I believe them, because that's what fanatical regimes do. Under the guidance of their top terrorist, Iran has been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. But now, the evil Soleimani is dead. Over the weekend, General David Petraeus even suggested that this strike, taking out Soleimani, was bigger than bin Laden and al-Baghdadi. And today, Defense Secretary Mark Esper said that a massive attack against Americans orchestrated by Soleimani was days away. Not weeks, days. Remember the 99% in the intelligence community that I have always talked about, that do a great job every day putting their lives at risk? Remember those guys? They did their job. A huge victory for our intelligence community, a huge victory for also our military and the president. He showed great patience. And by the way, we already know that in the case of Soleimani, he was responsible for the attack on our embassy in Baghdad. Remember, before he even got to the airport in Baghdad, we do know that the words, oh, Soleimani is our leader, because he orchestrated the terrorist attack, just like he is best friends with the leaders of Hezbollah. Now, we also know tonight that he had a close relationship with the leaders of Hezbollah, and we all know that he killed, injured, maimed hundreds of U.S. troops in the region. In fact, he directed a terrorist campaign to blow up Americans in the Middle East using an Iranian-made weapon called explosively formed penetrators. In other words, EFPs. Pay close attention. This is what the Iranians did to our troops in the Iraq War. Now, the EFPs, well, they're IEDs, but far more sophisticated and far more deadly. In a book entitled The Long Walk, Iraqi war veteran Brian Kastner, this is how he described the 2006 attack. Quote, "It took both legs off a soldier and one from a gunner. After the soldiers were medevaced out, there was still 1 foot left in the Humvee. Soleimani was the one that orchestrated that. He was the evil terrorist. Soleimani is now dead, blown to bits and pieces by a U.S. drone. His remains reportedly flew coach in a commercial airline back to Iran. And now we're just finding out how stupid the leaders of Iran really are. Because if they actually think they can attack Americans and get away with it, I think they need to think again. Do they actually think that they can kill our brave men and women abroad in our embassy and get away with it? Do they think they can fund terrorism all around the globe and get away with that? Do they think they can commit economic terrorism and try and impact the free flow of the lifeblood of every economy in the world and get away with that? There is a massive price to pay. You don't get to do what they did tonight. They have now been begging. The president wanted to talk and wants peace, and they're going to get hit hard. Their hostility will now be met with the full force of the greatest, most advanced, most sophisticated military this world has ever seen. As a former CIA station chief, Dan Hoffman, pointed out, any hostile action by Iran would be regime suicide. So let me be perfectly clear. I don't want boots on the ground. We don't need boots on the ground. The president has been clear. He's not putting boots on the ground. Might need a few more intelligence people, might need to protect very specific areas. And I know the Washington swamp creatures, they like to send our kids to war. Then they put them on the battlefield, then they politicize the war, and then they say, never mind. We can't allow that to ever happen again. Without boots on the ground whatsoever, the United States will be ready to decimate Iran's rogue leaders with our superior weaponry. So, by the way, if you happen to be, as Lindsey Graham tweeted out over the weekend, if you work in an Iranian refinery, you might want to get a new job. I'd start now. Now, their 3 major refineries could soon go up in flames. Their illicit nuclear sites may finally be annihilated. And the mullahs of Iran, well, they may want to watch and keep a watchful eye on the sky tonight as they look from their bunkers where I'm sure they are hiding. Powerful U.S. military forces, they are in position tonight. We can report 6 B-52 bombers are on the way to the region. Multiple carrier groups are already within striking distance, and in a show of force, 52 of the world's most advanced aircraft, the F-35, launched in succession at a U.S. military base. Because of the escalating aggression from this rogue terrorist regime in Iran, the United States is prepared and has been preparing for conflict for years. As Defense Secretary Esper said earlier today, the U.S. does not want war. Clearly, the president doesn't want a war, but we would be prepared to finish it. Still, we want peace. We are not going to have a long, protracted conflict any further, and I don't think we should have 1 boot on the ground. So for all you people trying to create this binary choice, it's either we let them attack us and kill Americans and attack our embassy and shoot out our drones and tankers hostage and take our competitors' facilities, or it's boots on the ground. No, that's not how it works. We have other options, thankfully, thanks to the greatest military force on earth, and they're prepared to use them. Joining us now with the very latest, our very own Jennifer Griffin tonight. Jennifer.
And for our entire country, for farm.
Tense situation. It does seem as though, and this is something that we've heard from Iranian officials, it's something very important. The Iranians don't want this to escalate any further, is what they've been telling me through various channels, Chris.
Well, actions speak louder than words. One of the questions for U.S. military to assess, thank you to Fred Pleitgen, we'll be back to him in a little bit, is whether or not they fired these missiles that are supposedly so accurate in a way that they would come close but not cause the kind of deadly damage they might have. Now, that question hangs on the answer of a full assessment of who was hurt and where. We don't have that yet. We're waiting on it. Let's go to Baghdad. Arwa Damon is positioned basically, right outside as a triangle of the 2 bases. Arwa Damon, what is the assessment you're hearing from sources on the ground about the damage done by the strikes?
Well, the U.S. military is saying at this stage, in their initial assessment, they do not believe that there are any U.S. casualties. However, it is worth reminding everyone who's watching that these U.S. military bases are often joint bases, as was the Al-Assad Air Base. So what we're hearing from an Iraqi security source is that there are reportedly casualties on the Iraqi side. We don't know how many. We don't know if these casualties were just wounded or killed, but we are receiving reports of those kinds of casualties. And this is a country that has been bracing itself, realizing that it is the physical battlefield at this stage between this brewing war between Washington and Tehran. The Iraqis that we've been talking to are saying that this is exactly what they have been fearing for quite some time now, that they are going to be on the receiving end of any sort of retaliation from either side, Chris. And also worth noting, though, that even if, let's assume that this is as far as Iran's response goes at this stage, let's assume that the U.S. does not somehow respond and escalate even further. In Iraq, this is not where it ends, because you still have the U.S. military here, and you still have these Shia paramilitary forces, Shia parliamentarians who do make up the majority of parliament, and a prime minister who have been saying that they want foreign forces to leave. And these Shia paramilitary groups, proxies of Iran, are saying that if the U.S. military does not leave, they are going to be forming some sort of resistance force. Who makes up these groups, Chris? The very same Shia militias who fought U.S. forces during the U.S.-led occupation here. So even if we do have some sort of easing of tensions at the level of Washington and Tehran, that doesn't necessarily translate into an easing of tensions on the ground in Iraq.
Now, understandable and very important perspective, and the biggest problem in terms of how much catalyzing there is you don't have Tehran and Washington, D.C. talking to each other. Right now, we know of no channels of communication, which means it's hard for things to get better. Arwa, you're going to keep the feed in your ear. When you hear the conversation with Chertoff and the other experts we're having going forward, when there are points you want to make or things you hear on the ground, let me know. I'll come right back to you. Same for Fred Pleitgen in Tehran, and obviously we're monitoring the White House. Hopefully we get no other word from there tonight, because that may well be an introduction of some new action, and I don't know why anybody wants to hear that at this point. So, with all the information on the ground,
the Iraqi prime minister today responding by saying, quote, "This was not something that happened all of a sudden. It was not a piece of paper that fell out of a photocopy machine."
I'll be making a statement tomorrow morning. Here now, retired Army Brigadier General Tony Tata, along with retired CIA officer Dan Hoffman. Good to see you both. You're both heroes. General, we'll start with you. The president's next move, I think Colonel North nailed it. The launch sites, the refineries, and maybe the nuclear sites. If they push this issue, and if they killed Americans tonight, all bets are off.
Yeah, roger that. My sources, Sean, are telling me that there are two major packages here. There's one where if there are American casualties as a result of these strikes, then that's the 52 target package, and that will be launched if the president determines to launch that because of casualties. If there are no casualties, however, then I think the president has led us to a very good position here. You know, there's a Sun Tzu saying that the greatest victory is that where you don't have to take the battlefield. And last night I mentioned that this administration, this president, is the best I've ever seen at leveraging the elements of national power to accomplish national security goals, diplomatic, information, military, economic. And so with Iran had the capability to hit the airfield. They know where our troops are. They shot drones out of the sky. They hit the Saudi oil field, and they can't hit targets on the airfield. This could have been a deliberate miss, Sean, and it could be that they are very, very scared because of the strength the president has shown to kill Americans.
General, if John Roberts has one source telling him that, I have one source telling me that.
Roger.
It would be the best case scenario. I mean, no American lost their life tonight, but it also would be very telling. They only wanted a propaganda video, and there's a fear behind that decision if in fact they did that. But again, we don't know.
President Obama and President Trump, Mr. McGurk, resigned from that post last December. Brett McGurk, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. It's good to have you here.
Thanks, Rachel.
So we are obviously watching this as an unfolding news story. We've got word claimed responsibility by the Iranian government and confirmation by the U.S. Defense Department that it's more than a dozen ballistic missiles fired at least two sites in Iraq where U.S. troops are based. How important is it that Iraq has used ballistic missiles here, and what do you make about this sort of level of escalation given what we've seen over the past few days?
Well, Rachel, a couple hours ago, it looked like this was a really dramatic event, potentially with casualties. It looked like the president might address the nation. I said then it was very important to calm down, slow things down, let's get all the facts. As the facts come in, it looks like ballistic missiles launched from Iran on Iraqi bases that house Americans, targeting Americans, is a significant event. If the facts come out that there are no American casualties, I think we will learn very soon. The U.S. military will have the capabilities. Did they deliberately not really intend to cause any casualties? What was the Iranian intention? And I think we should really take our time as a country and as a government to work through this and determine how we respond. This could be a moment to try to de-escalate this situation, and I would hope that the administration would consider doing that.
In terms of taking our time and considering our response, I'm always worried about saying these words, especially live on television, but the president has just tweeted tonight about these missile strikes just within the past couple of minutes. Let me put this to you and get your response. The president says, and I quote, "All is well!" exclamation point. Missiles launched from Iran at 2 military bases located in Iraq. Assessment of casualties and damages taking place now. So far, so good! Exclamation point. We have the most powerful and well-equipped military anywhere in the world by far! Exclamation point. I will be making a statement tomorrow morning. Your reaction to the president saying all is well here?
I'm not sure I would say all is well. I've been under fire from rockets. I know what that sounds like, what that feels like. Never a ballistic missile. I can imagine. We've had Americans under fire tonight. I think it's very fortunate that there are no casualties. We should all be very thankful. There may be Iraqi casualties here. One thing, Rachel, you mentioned just this kind of cycle of events since the Soleimani attack with the letter in Iraq and the Iraqis trying to kick us out of the country, perhaps. That's what Iran wants. They want us to leave the country. They want NATO to leave. They want all of our coalition partners to leave so that they can really dominate. You would see ISIS resurge. I think you would see Russia fill in behind us. It'd be a strategic calamity. This could be an opportunity with some diplomacy from the president, Secretary Pompeo, if they want to go that route. I hope they do, to really work with the Iraqi leadership, as weak as it is, and make the point this was an attack on an Iraqi base targeting us, targeting Americans, but it was an attack on an Iraqi base, and just try to reset that relationship a bit to get out of this spiral that's been going on with this letter and what's happening. So I hope somebody in the Situation Room, I've been in the Situation Room, in moments of crisis, there's usually an authoritative voice will come in and say, let's calm down, let's work our way through this, let's think of our response, and that's really what's needed now. So hopefully somebody's doing that, and we can find our way through this to a better outcome than where we've been over the last 96 hours.
Brett McGurk, former special president.
In my view, based on what I know, to come to Congress and have a conference with the Gang of Eight or whoever, and I don't think it would be appropriate to do that anyway.
I take your counsel on that. You know information we don't. That's part of the problem here, is that this president's told us not to trust U.S. intelligence. I never took that seriously, but he apparently did. And he said classified, confidential informants, forget it. They're all deep state buzzwords. Now's the time for him to give us the information that you apparently have so American people can be on the same page. I thank you for your argument here tonight, Congressman, and your perspective. You're always welcome on the show. God bless.
Thank you.
All right. So that's Mike Rogers. In case you're just tuning in now, we're going to bring you up to speed on everything that's been happening. Iran has retaliated. They believe they were justified under Article 51 of the UN Charter. I don't know that that's a good case. But we know what's happened, we know why, and we now have a better understanding of what may or may not happen next. Stay with CNN.
Like a lot of women, energy sites, infrastructure sites, if it comes to that, that's where it needs to go. That's how you truly cripple the regime. Iran used to be great. Tehran used to be great and free.
Pete, this is the elephant in the room. A squared, B squared, C squared. Radical Islamists with nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
Equals a potential modern day Holocaust. You know,
This is the Islamic State, State of the Middle East. It is the Islamic State of the Middle East, the Shia version.
Dan and Pete, stay where you are. We bring in Congressman Michael.
We're wondering what Congress will do at all in terms of exerting their own authority under the Constitution to make a decision about war and peace here. What do you anticipate?
Certainly, Rachel, Congress has unfortunately been missing in action. There's several courses of action that we're talking about. One is we're talking about a very strong War Powers Act, which would rein in this administration and require them to come to Congress before they take military action. Secondly, we're looking at, and I'm working to make sure that the 2002 authorization, which was the authorization to use force against Iraq, is repealed. That passed in the National Defense Authorization Bill with 242 votes. It was bipartisan, and so we should repeal that because this administration uses the 2001, 2002 authorizations in many ways, we're hearing, as the legal justification. Thirdly, Congressman Khanna, myself, and others have passed legislation that would say no funding to use force against Iraq unless the administration comes to Congress and asks for an authorization or a declaration. So we need to withhold the funding until this administration comes and debates an authorization to talk about, and so the public can understand the costs and consequences of what this means.